All right, well, welcome everyone that's coming in to Behind the Wines video series. We're just going to wait a moment for everyone to log in, and then we'll get started. All right, so I think we're going to get started here. Good morning and welcome everyone to the second installment of California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host Elaine Chukan Brown. We've got a great turnout today, over 590 registered from 22 countries. So thank you all for taking the time out and being a part of this. If this is your first time joining us, this is a weekly series featuring a virtual chat and tasting with Elaine and some of California's top winemaking and viticulture talents. And today we have the privilege to welcome our guest, Jasmine Hirsch, General Manager and Winemaker of Hirsch Vineyards. So at the start of each episode, we will go through some brief housekeeping reminders. So first, please be sure that your lines are muted. You'll note that there are two communication methods available to participants that we encourage you to use. So there's a chat section as well as a Q&A section. So keep in mind these are different. The chat section is more of an informal way for you to communicate with with other participants. So just make sure in the to field you select all panelists and attendees. And then the Q&A section, so this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and Jasmine to answer towards the end of the webinar. We will do our best to answer your questions, but we will also, any questions that are not answered live will be provided in the Q&A summary in the email that you will receive following the program. So this session will also be recorded and the video replay will be available on California Wine Institute's YouTube channel. And we will also provide a link to the video in the follow-up email that you will all receive. So now I'll turn it over to our host, Elaine, who many of you know. She is a wine writer and educator. She writes for her own website, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, for JancesRobinson.com as the American specialist and contributes to a long list of respected publications. So we'll turn it over to Elaine to introduce Jasmine and start the discussion.
Great. I'm so excited to see everyone. Thank you all so much for calling in. It's really quite an incredible honor and even overwhelming to have so many people registered and from so many countries. I know quite a few of you are actually calling in the middle of the night in order to be here today. And so thank you so much for that. Jasmine, it is great to see you.
Hi, Elaine.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. And one of the things I want to just address right away, you know, a lot of people are really curious about how wineries have been impacted by the current situation we're all in. But something you and I have talked about quite a lot is, you know, you have an estate program. You're actually making wine from your own vineyards. That means you're farming all year long. But it also means you have to have a really long-term vision to, you know, and your business plan has to be thinking about contingencies. Could you speak a little bit to that reality?
Yeah, so a number of people have asked how we are, quote unquote, pivoting during COVID-19. And of course, like many of our peers, we're trying to sell more wine online. We're trying to do what we can to support our colleagues in the restaurant industry. We're protecting our employees by practicing social distancing and working from home. But this concept of making a pivot in, for example, in the types of wines that we make or in the amount of wine that we make is not really an option that's available when you farm and own land. It's an incredible privilege to own our own land and to be able to live there and to make wines from there. But my father has always talked about the 200-year plan, and the 200-year plan is the plan that he has and is developing and working with his kids to develop to take care of the land that we own, which is more than just the vineyards. And so that 200-year plan both has to, by its nature, build in contingencies for, I mean, of course, we don't have a contingency plan for a global pandemic because nobody could have anticipated this, but certainly for many different types of extreme situations. That's not to say that we are completely prepared for what's going on right now. Quite the contrary. I mean, we're scrambling just like everyone else, but we have built into our, for example, our farming projections. Our long-term average yields are 2.4 tons per acre for the Pinot Noir. That's average, and that's dropping off really low-yielding vintages like 2005 or 2015, which were disasters for the coastal vineyards. And so when we build our economic models and our farming models, we assume that 1.5 vintages out of 10 is going to have yields closer to 1 ton an acre. So we build in things like that already. And it's both a blessing and a curse to be tied to a piece of land. There's no pivot when you live and work in one place.
Right. Well, and I mean, we should really focus in and show everybody where you're actually located. Because one of the things, as an example, your vineyard and winery are so remote that we had to ask you to come into the city today in order to get enough internet bandwidth to actually be able to do a video webinar.
Yeah.
You know, as an example. But Katie, could you go ahead and show us the map that that gives us a sense of where Hirsch is located there in Sonoma? Okay, so if you think about California as a whole, we're focused in now just on Sonoma County, and to the right of the boundary that you see there would be Napa Valley, of course. To the north would be Mendocino, and then to the south is Marin. But you can see there, that's the Pacific Ocean. Sonoma County, of course, is right on the Pacific Ocean. And Hirsch is 2.5 kilometers. Is that right? 2.5 miles?
4 kilometers.
4 kilometers, 2.5 miles from the ocean. And in fact, you can see the ocean from parts of the vineyard. But
Correct.
Notice too, it's within this large green-gray area called the Sonoma Coast AVA. And one of the things I want to point out, because we'll talk about this more specifically in a minute, but look how big the Sonoma Coast AVA is. It, at the time that it was created, our thinking about locations for wine growing were really climate focused. And so the original thinking with developing the Sonoma Coast AVA was to cover all the areas that have a really serious marine impact. So lots of fog and ocean wind. But notice how big it is, and it goes quite a bit inland. And now if we could focus in even more closely on the second map. Now we've dialed into just the coastal part of Sonoma County, and you'll see it actually pinpoints the location of Hirsch Vineyard. And that red boundary there is actually the newer AVA, which is smaller and nested within Sonoma Coast. It's Fort Ross Seaview AVA, which was certified in 2012. And you'll notice Hirsch is actually even there, one of the closest to the ocean. So there's a lot of ocean influence. And then one more is a photo of the vineyard. And if you look there on the horizon, that is the Pacific. So that this photo is taken standing in the vineyard, and you can actually see the ocean there. But so let's come back to Jasmine. So what part of what that means is that you're really getting direct weather from the ocean, and having to farm. You talked about your yields are really quite modest, but you're also dealing with actual ocean weather, and it's one of the rainiest parts of California too, isn't it?
Yes, all of that's correct. Our average rainfall is about 200 centimeters a year, which is actually makes us a temperate zone rainforest. This year,
right, so more than 70 inches.
Yes, about 80 inches is the average, 200 centimeters. And we are, as you mentioned, we're 4 kilometers from the ocean. So my father likes to say we don't have a climate, we have weather.
Right.
Of course, we do have both, but it's interesting. I mean, California is a bit of a breadbasket, which is wonderful. It makes it possible for us to grow all different kinds of agricultural products here. And we certainly do enjoy quite nice weather during the summer out on the coast. I mean, generally the summertime in California, it doesn't rain at all, which means we're not dealing with the viticultural issues that can come from rain. Right.
But those 70, 80 inches are coming in the winter.
That's all in the winter. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And then for us on the coast, the yields are really driven by the weather during the spring. So we can have really cold, foggy weather during the spring, which can lead to poor set, which means that the yields can be really, really low. The other thing that's really important about our climate is that it is we do get a lot of fog, but the fog tends to burn off during the day.
Yeah.
We sit at about 500 meters or 1,500 feet elevation. So during the daytime, during the growing season, it's usually very sunny, but quite cool. So we have the cool ocean breeze, but all that sunshine. So
Right.
we're really ripening the wines, ripening the grapes, I should say, with a lot of light relative to heat. So you can produce wines that have a lot of flavor intensity, but are still really elegant, high acid, and fresh.
Well, and that's one of the things that we know through viticultural studies now is that there's actually, you know, you can develop flavors through kind of UV and light exposure. Sugar development is more through heat.
Yes.
And then that cooling weather that you have at night really helps keep the acid. So you're in a really unique position. You know, you're essentially doing mountain Pinot, which is something we don't tend to talk about a lot, but you're not just making Pinot Noir, you're actually growing mountain Pinot Noir.
Mountain Pinot Noir, and also I think important is to say ridgetop Pinot Noir.
Yeah,
so
right.
when you're up on those ridges, and then with the amount of rainfall that we get, you also have to remember that the coastal hills of California used to be entirely covered in redwood forests. The forests were cut down, you know, starting around the time of the Civil War, but really accelerating after the 1906 earthquake that destroyed San Francisco. So you have complete clear cutting combined with 200 centimeters of rain on average a year, and then these very steep ridge tops. So most of the topsoil is gone. So we're farming on these very low vigor subsoils, and also in this very cool climate, which also contributes to another factor in our wines and in the wines that you see from our region, which is tannin. I think these are the Fort Ross Seaview Pinot Noirs and the Hirsch Pinot Noirs tend to be relatively high in tannin for New World Pinot Noir, which is something that we absolutely cultivate and want to preserve in the wines.
Right. The other big thing that comes up with you mentioning ridgetop farming, though, is you're actually on the San Andreas Fault. And so you have an incredible diversity of soils, and you and your dad have had to really build that into how you farm and how you built the blocks even, right?
Correct. Yeah. So geologists call our soil type the Franciscan assembly. And assembly simply refers to the fact that it's an assemblage of all these different soil types. We actually have about 30 different soil series combinations within Hirsch. The vineyard, total planted acreage is about 70 acres or 30 hectares, and that's divided into 60 farming parcels. And these 60 parcels are necessitated by our proximity to the San Andreas Fault. So the fault line, you know, being less about a kilometer away from us or about half a mile from us, means that the soils have this incredible diversity. And then you have a lot of microclimates, which are created by the complexity of the topography interacting with the marine climate. So the east-facing vineyards could potentially be quite a bit warmer during the day than the west-facing vineyards, for example, and then you've got different soils. So these 60 different vineyard parcels, some of which are smaller than half a hectare, are necessitated by this underlying complexity.
Well, and you know, we're talking about Hirsch wines today, but really we're also talking about Hirsch Vineyard, and you actually sell fruit to some of the top Pinot producers in California. And one of the things I think that's interesting, when, you know, a couple times I've been able to get together a collection of Hirsch Vineyard Pinots and taste them side by side. And some of those producers, they can have neighboring blocks, but have completely different soils. And you'll see a real contrast in the wine expression from that as well.
When we organize horizontal tastings of all of the different folks that have bought wine from us over the years, it's fascinating because, of course, your first instinct is to say, okay, the William Sellium Hirsch Pinot Noir is different from the Littori Hirsch Pinot Noir because of winemaking. And of course, there's different winemaking choices there, but the underlying parcels that they were buying fruit from are also completely different. Hirsch is more comparable to a village in Burgundy than to a single vineyard.
Right. Just that real sense of, you know, the nuance that they've been able to dial in Burgundy with parcel to parcel, you know, this Ludi is different from that Ludi, and getting so specific down to subsoils like you're talking about. You really have gotten to see that at Hirsch, because you've been farming Hirsch since 1980, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and you were really one of the first families to plant and get things going out there, which I think needs to be said too. It's really about that pioneering spirit and being willing to push closer to the ocean than had really been done before at that point.
Yeah, my father, the first people to plant in our region was the Bohan family, and they're ranchers, sheep and cattle ranchers. And now
early 1970s, right?
That was in the early 1970s, and they planted vineyards as a way to supplement their farming income, their ranching income, because again, you know, it's a difficult place to farm and live. And so, you know, but it is traditionally a ranching community. So they were in the mid 70s. My father started planting in 1980, and it was considered a completely insane idea to plant where he planted within sight of the ocean. People told him, you know, you were not going to get your grapes ripe and all of that. Luckily he's very stubborn and doesn't listen. So he went ahead and planted anyways. You know, but it took about 15 years before people started to really take him seriously. I mean, it wasn't, so he planted in 1980, the first vines. It wasn't until 94 that some of those amazing winemakers that I mentioned and people of their caliber started to pay attention. So he was really out there farming in the wilderness and selling his grapes mostly for bulk wine until 1994.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing. Well, and really the first vines to go into the area were actually Zinfandel, and it wasn't till later they realized Pinot would be the better way to go. And with like what the work that your family's done. But also just to get across the point of remoteness again, I know you finished the winery there in 2003, I think, but to do that, you actually had to put in 10 miles of electrical cable. Is that right?
Well, so when growing up there, we had 12 volt electricity, a lot of gas lighting and things like that. We didn't have regular power. But of course, to run a winery, you need real power. So my father built a 10-mile long power line to connect to our local utility, to connect to PG&E when he built the winery. Just to give you an idea of how, I mean, there's only two wineries out where there's three wineries, out where we are. There's a lot of vineyards, but it's a very complicated place to engage in, to live, to farm, but especially to engage in something like winemaking. I mean, we're on all dirt roads. So for example, we can't get a bottling truck up the road. So we had to purchase our own bottling line, which as a small winery was a pretty big investment and not something I think we would have done otherwise. We have to time our large deliveries to not come in the winter months because of the rain we get. The roads could be washed out. So it's a very extreme and remote location. But my father was insistent. He said, real wine is made in the place where the grapes are grown. And this comes back to the estate model. We're about, the whole ranch is about 1,000 acres or 400 hectares, of which only that small 30 hectares is planted to vineyard. But
a lot of that, just to clarify, a lot of that's because a bunch of the land is down the canyon, essentially, right?
Yeah, it's so steep. Most of it's not planted, not plantable at all. So for us, it's, having the winery there, living there, the vineyards, and then now the other agricultural activities that we're engaged in, some of which is really just around protecting that wild space, reforestation, preventing erosion, those sorts of things, which are so important to the health of the entire place. And that we believe, looking at it through a biodynamic lens, we believe that the wild space and the other things that we're cultivating can really contribute back to the vineyards.
Well, because that's one of the ideas with biodynamics too, that you don't have a biodynamic vineyard, you have a biodynamic farm, right? Yes. And so I want to take some time to talk about that too, because being so close to the ocean and with being one of the rainiest parts of California, it's really easy to start talking about disease pressure and concerns with mold or mildew. But you've actually been able, starting in 11, I believe it was, to convert to biodynamic farming, and you've stuck with that. Can you talk through some of the challenges of that, but also how you make it work?
Yeah, so actually, I just, hang on, there's a lawnmower next door. You move inside, hold on.
I was saying earlier, I got an email last night that my CSA delivery is supposed to be dropped off sometime today. So if a whole bunch of kale suddenly appears in front of me, I apologize.
Okay, we'll try this.
Okay.
Can't hear the lawnmower. So yeah, the biodynamics has been, it was so interesting when we first started. My father and we've had the same vineyard manager for 30 years, Everardo Robledo. Everardo lives on the property right next to the winery. and he's basically like family for us and family for the vines too. His biggest concern was the seasonal disease pressure, the powdery mildew and the botrytis and things like that. And of course, that has been a challenge, you know, not having access to chemical fungicides, but we've actually found that the incidence of seasonal disease has gone down. And is that correlated with, you know, when we started the Biodynamics, California entered into a drought the next year. So could that have been part of it? We're not really, you know, it's difficult to say exactly, but certainly the vines seem to be healthier and seem to have less problems with seasonal disease.
Right.
And the thing that has actually proven to be one of the largest practical challenges has been the under vine cultivation. So in the past we used herbicides to manage the weeds under the vine, to manage the cover crop. Of course, we haven't used those since we converted, and mowing has been really a challenge. It might
because it's so steep and rugged there, right?
It's so steep and rugged, and because of the amount of rain we get, I mean, sometimes we have to mow 3 or 4 times. So the labor is intensive, the wear and tear on equipment is intensive, and we've tried a number of different under the vine mowers and tillers, and it's a real constant challenge, and
right.
It wasn't the challenge we were expecting.
Right.
So that was interesting.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. But I think that brings us to, like, let's go ahead and start talking about your wine. You probably unfortunately had to leave it outside.
I did.
I don't know if they're still mowing.
You'll have to drink alone, Elaine.
Okay. Well, but one of the things I love, I asked Jasmine to pick 2 wines, one of her own and then a second from another producer. And the thing I love about the wine you picked from Hirsch is that you picked East Ridge. It's one of the older plantings that's at the property now. And it's actually, do I remember correctly that it's own rooted as well?
No, so this vineyard is the oldest vines are own rooted. This is from some of the next oldest vines.
Right.
We're on AXR1.
They are on it. Okay. But I know one of the things that you and I have talked about previously, though, is just that there have been some health challenges with this block because of the AXR1, but that you actually have found that the biodynamic farming has been restoring the health of the vines.
So yes, so these vineyards, the East Ridge vines, the majority of them are on AXR rootstock, and as a consequence have phylloxera. We started, you know, we have found the biodynamic toolbox to be very helpful in bringing up the overall health of the vineyards, and particularly in vineyards like the East Ridge that have underlying disease issues like phylloxera. So we have seen that this vineyard has really improved in health. It's improved its ability to ripen and to set fruit. So the yields have come back up a little bit, and also the ripeness has come back up a bit, which is actually, we felt that this vineyard was not quite achieving enough ripeness. I mean, it was around 12% alcohol in some of the more recent vintages, and it's a very tannic vineyard. So in the 2017 vintage, you have an alcohol level of about 13%, which for us was a positive, and a strong indication that the vines have been able to return to some of their vigor and ability to produce sugar. And we attribute that to the biodynamics.
Right. Could I pause you just for a second? Is there maybe a table or something that you could sit so that I'm being asked by our tech person if we can make I'll go ahead and chat a little bit more about what you said while you get stable.
Great.
So one of the things they really draw out here in terms of what what Jasmine just said was just the idea that sometimes we talk about alcohol levels in wine as if they're an absolute, and sometimes even as if the lower the better. But in actuality, each vineyard and variety have their own natural range, which you could think of as the comfortable home for that particular variety and an expression of place. And so you can have a case like this where, you know, you might think, oh, 12% Pinot, that's perfect. But actually, at that level, depending on the vineyard and the farming, you could be missing the balance of this full structural development with the flavors. And so part of what Jasmine's getting at is that they've actually been able to bring the vine health back to a point where the fruit can actually develop and to that really great structural balance with the flavors. And we got a question in earlier that's asking about, comparing flavors on the San Andreas Fault to elsewhere. And I think one of the things to point out there is that it's less about flavor and more about that overall character of the wine. That when you're talking about mountain Pinot in the far Sonoma Coast, like we are with Jasmine now, what you get is a kind of elevated tannin. But I really love the elegance of this wine, though. I say it's elevated tannin, but the tannin, there's a lot of precision here. And then you also tend to get elevated acidity. So there's a ton of freshness and really mouth-watering presence in the mouth. And I think that what the coastal mountains of Sonoma bring to Pinot are just that sense of intensity. But with, this wine is so incredibly elegant. It is, there's a lot of intensity here, but it's not that it's a big wine. There's actually incredible detail, I think.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you for the moment to get resettled and to actually also grab the wine.
Yeah, good.
Yes, I it's really interesting. I think we want to make wines that have a lot of depth, intensity, texture, but are naturally elegant and fresh, that have natural acidity. We want, as I mentioned earlier, and as you just touched on, we want that tannin in the wines, but we want the tannins to have enough time to become long and supple, both during the growing process and of course also during the aging. So I do think that being out on the coast is the first step for Pinot Noir for being able to achieve those goals, but it also has to happen in the vineyard. One of the things that's been really interesting about working with diseased vines like the Eastridge, and we also have vines that have leaf roll virus on the Westridge, has been, if you can find a way to farm those vines with those diseases in a way that you can still produce wines that are ripe and delicious, those diseases actually slow down sugar accumulation.
Right.
So you have this opportunity to produce these really incredibly intensely flavored wines that are still really elegant. And now, of course, we have lots of healthy vines, and so we also need to achieve those goals in those healthy vineyards as well. And so a lot of our farming practices are focused on that. You have to farm for balance before you can produce it in the wines.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a quick question about comparing the style of Sonoma Coast Pinot with those of other parts of the world. One of the things I'd say is the Willamette Valley Pinot, of course, is hugely respected. There's a little bit more flesh to it. Like in Willamette Valley Pinot, you can still have great acid, but the tannin character is very different. And again, the thing that really stands out to me about this Hirsch Eastridge is the precision and detail to it. I want to make sure we have time to talk about your second wine too, but one more thing I'll comment on that came up in questions. This is the 2017 vintage, and of course it's now famously known for being a wildfire year. But the thing about Pinot is it's early harvesting, and so this wine came in long before the fires even happened. That's right.
We were actually finished barreling down when the fire started. And I think, most vineyards had been picked when the fires started. It was I think for most of us as winemakers, we're not going to remember this vintage for the effect it had on the wines. We're going to remember it for the effect it had on our communities and in some cases directly on our businesses and homes. But for us, the wildfires had no effect on the wines in 2017. And I think that's true for most of our region.
Yeah, and the other comment to make about where you're located in that vintage, there was a lot of up and down weather with like different waves of intense heat that happened that year. But the temperatures were a lot more even out there closer to the coast, right?
Yeah, it was a warm vintage overall, and then we had some really intense heat waves right at the start of harvest. And for us, but yes, it was a more temperate than it was elsewhere. But for us, we did make some choices in the winemaking to make sure that we were preserving freshness in the wine. So, for example, this vintage has only about 10% whole cluster compared to a cooler, let's say more typical vintage like 2016 or 2018, where the whole cluster is closer to 40.
Right. Okay, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for your second wine. So could you go ahead and tell us what this is? I love when we were talking about choosing your wines, you and I spoke for a while about that. And I have to say I love the surprise of what you chose. I kind of, without realizing it, expected you to pick another Pinot, but you went a completely different direction.
Yes. So very happy to be able to taste and talk with you guys about this wine. And we have a special guest.
Yes. So, so before we bring in our special guest, I need to ask you to to tell us why, what was it about Corison? Why Corison?
Okay, well, two things. First is an anecdote. So I was with my father and our family in New York City. My sister lives there, and we were out for dinner. This was some years ago. And, growing up, my father, he's a Burgundy drinker, and he drinks a lot of Piedmontese wines and things like that, champagne. I have to admit, I've never seen Cabernet-based wine in his cellar. So we're out for dinner at this restaurant in New York, and he orders Cabernet. And it was years ago, it was like 15 years ago. I have to admit, I had not heard of Corson. And I said, what is going on? My father's ordering not just Cabernet, but Napa Cabernet. And it was Corson. And so that opened my eyes. So you were surprised by my choice. I was surprised by my father's choice on that day. And since then, I've had the opportunity to taste the wines a few times and to meet Cathy and to learn more about how she makes wines. And I feel that there's the estate connection. The belief that the true belief, not just paying lip service, but actually believing and working in such a way to hold to this belief that the wine is made in the vineyard. It's all starting in the vineyard. And the second thing is the stylistic approach. Again, that these wines have so much intensity, depth, texture, complexity, and yet they're incredibly elegant. They're balanced in terms of alcohol. They have great acidity. I just feel that they are, there's a corollary to these Corson wines to our Pinot Noirs.
Well, and the thing is, I have to admit, I know both wines really well, but I've never had them side by side. And it's actually, I could totally see a sort of mutual respect in the wines themselves. So one of the things that came up though, when you and I were talking and selecting the wines to address today, you said you really wanted to choose Corson, but you didn't want to speak to the wine in the sense, because you knew you weren't the winemaker. And so I was like, oh, well, let me see what we can do. And so Katie was kind enough to reach out to Cathy, and then Cathy and I spoke as well. And guess who we have here? Cathy, can you, I'm so excited, but Cathy Corison's actually here, and I would love, Cathy, for you to talk to us about your 2016 Napa Valley Cabernet.
Oh, just a second.
There you are.
There I am. Hi, it's such an honor to be in this company, and I love, it's two different flavors, but the same philosophy, really. We've spent all these years working toward being a state. We started out 32 years ago, buying all our grapes and making our wine in other people's facilities. And slowly we've built a winery, and slowly we've gotten to the point where once all of our vineyards are in production, we'll be 100% estate.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So,
well, and you actually farm some of the oldest Cabernet in Napa Valley as well, right there at the winery.
Right, the estate vineyard, the Kronos vineyard that surrounds the winery, is one of the last old Cabernet vineyards in the Napa Valley. It'll be 50 years old next year.
Right, and you've been farming organically for quite a long time, and I know you spend a lot of time, again, like going back to what Jasmine was saying with the Eastridge, focusing on that vine health and restoring that too.
We've been farming organically for more than a quarter century, and I spend at least 3/4 of my time out there in the vineyard.
Yeah.
Because I can't make the wine any better than the grapes that come in the door.
Well, and just as an anecdote to illustrate that, we kept trying to get a hold of each other, but I kept missing you because every time I'd call, you were actually in the vineyard working on the vines.
Yeah.
So
I was there this morning.
Yeah. Jasmine, I want to get you and Cathy talking. I know you guys have spent some time together and met in person, of course, but what is it you want to hear Cathy talk about today?
Well, I would love to know what are the specific viticultural choices that you're making. I mean, maybe even from the beginning of choosing plant material that allow you to make wine like this when all around you, the style is for the most part quite a bit riper and bigger and more alcoholic. There are specific choices that we make viticulturally, and I'd be curious to know what yours are that help you achieve this style.
Well, first of all, fashion in wine comes and goes, stylistic fashion, and we've seen that cycle a couple of times. So it's not Napa Valley's fault that the Napa Valley Cabernets got to be very big wines. Those were stylistic choices. And I had cut my teeth on European wines more than 45 years ago. And my sensibilities have always been to prefer wines that have a life force, a vibration. They have, they're aromatic. They are both powerful and elegant. Cabernet is going to be a powerful wine no matter what you do, but it's way more interesting to me at the intersection of elegance. So I've spent my entire life chasing that. And so functionally, that means we spend a lot of time in the vineyard. And the keys for me are, number one, we're on the benchland, which is our jargon for alluvial soils. They're extremely well drained, but they have good water holding capacity for the spring and into the summer. And as you mentioned, there's no rain in the summer, so the vines stop growing when they should and get busy ripening the grapes. So part of it is site, climate, and soils. But after that, we're doing two things out there. We're balancing the way the vine grows and the way it fruits. And then we're spending a lot of time tweaking the canopy to get the right amount of air and light in. And the key is to be able to pick the grapes at lower sugars so that the wines can have good, snappy, natural acidity and moderate alcohol, grace the table, have a long, interesting life. And that really is a matter of getting the seeds to lignify and to get the fruit to develop all the complexity we want quickly so that we can, my Cabernets have always been under 14% alcohol. And that's, and I've never de-alcoholized a wine in my life. So those are natural alcohols.
Well, and one of the things that I think is coming up here that both of you share is, again, you know, you're in what turn out to be really ideal locations for your varieties, but you're making a choice that you want to have an interest in elegance and freshness and energy, as you're saying, but both of you are then honing in the farming to get the vines in a position to do that well. You know, so when we talk about making wine from place, it's not just get the vines in there and let them do their thing. It's actually like really paying attention to canopy management, airflow, sunlight exposure, soil health, all of these factors that make that kind of balance at lower alcohols possible. But again, you have to have enough ripeness too. It's not just about picking early.
Exactly. We get all tangled up in talking about alcohols, and when alcohol is just an index of ripeness, it's really all the things that come with lower alcohol that are important to me. The complete range of Cabernet flavors, all the way from the bright red and blue fruits through to the purple and black. They can all be in the same glass at the same time. So wonderful complexity. And then good snappy natural acidity. We have cold nights here. So we have plenty of heat to get Cabernet ripe. That takes a lot of heat, but the temperatures plummet into the 50s every single night. So
even in the summer.
Especially in the summer, yeah, because the fog comes in every night. And so we have this perfect situation for Cabernet Sauvignon. Lots of heat to get it ripe, but cold nights to keep natural acidity, to make inkier color, and to make more complex flavors.
Yeah, I love though that, again, that, you know, Jasmine, there was a kind of brilliance in you picking Corson, because again, I think our wine industry is so used to thinking varietally that it's not, again, it was a surprise to put a Corson Cabernet alongside a Hirsch Pinot Noir, but there's actually so much, it's not familial resemblance, but there's a sense of mutual respect actually in the expression that I think can be seen in these two wines.
Well, and there's a philosophical approach, and I think, you know, a real respect for the vineyards. I mean, I would also say that, Cathy, you remind me a lot of my father in that you have, like what you said about style, you know, we you know, that, and you have made your own path and you've kept to it. And that's the same thing for my father. As I mentioned, you know, 15 years he was farming on the Sonoma Coast and nobody cared what he was doing. Now, if he goes to a restaurant, well, nobody can go to restaurants right now. But when we can all go back to restaurants, you know, my father is, people are so happy to see him and excited, but you know, that's now. And I think it's what matters is what you do when nobody's watching, when nobody's paying attention. And I think, you know, to stick to your path, like my father has done, is so remarkable and so special, and it has resulted in a portfolio of wines that that you've made that are really unique within California and unique within the world, and present the drinker with such an incredible opportunity to have something that is totally different and totally special and self-contained and has reached its own pinnacle, which is really, really remarkable.
So I'm looking through some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. And one of the, as a quick side note, somebody asked if we could see a map of Cathy's Vineyard. Unfortunately, we didn't preload that, so we don't have that with us. But if you were to get out a book that has a map of California, look for Napa Valley, and then look for St. Helena. So Corson is located on the far western side of St. Helena, which is further north in Napa Valley. And importantly, Cathy's Vineyards are all in what's called the Mayacamas Bench, which again is the alluvial soils that have been settled from water activity coming out of the Mayacamas. And the reason that's relevant is because they're very high draining, gravelly soils, which is really important for Cabernet. So again, look to St. Helena and on the far west. But one of the other questions that I think is coming up here for both of you is just how, we keep kind of touching on it, but if you can speak to how does organic and or biodynamic practices, how is that showing up in the wines themselves? Do you have thoughts on, we've talked about how it impacts vine health for each of you, but do you have any comments on, can you see that in the wine? That's one of the questions that's come up.
I think that the gravelly soils coupled with the wildly alive soils from organic farming make the minerality in my wines possible. It's said that it's the life in the soils that are able to break down the minerals in the soils and make them available to the vines. And I think that our Cabernet is rare in Napa and having in most vintages, a pretty strong minerality. And so I think that organic farming is key to that.
Mm-hmm. Jasmine, your family actually shifted from into biodynamic farming in 2011. Have you seen it? Do you feel like you can name a shift in what you're seeing in the wine itself since then?
Maybe not quite yet. I think the Eastridge is probably the best and most, or let's say it's the most extreme example of the improved health of the vines that we've seen with the introduction of biodynamics. Right. For the rest of the vineyards, it's still a bit difficult to draw a line. I have to admit, I feel it more than taste it. I feel it in the vineyard. And I think probably the biggest change is getting away from herbicides and feeling and seeing the additional biodiversity in the vineyards, the increased insect life, and obviously, of course, the increased biodiversity on the ground. But I'm not sure yet how to tie that directly to the wines. I think it's still early days for us.
Well, and the two vineyards are in relatively, or two estates are in relatively different places. Of course, St. Helena and Napa Valley and far Sonoma Coast for Pinot. And so, but one of the questions that's coming up too is what are some of the changes and challenges that you've seen in the vineyard or also in the wine with climate change being a factor, temperatures changing over time?
So for us, we're seeing warmer nights. I mean, Cathy mentioned, and you as well, Elaine, the importance of cool nights. We don't get that hot during the day, but we still don't, but we are not cooling off as much at night as we used to. And we think, like, for example, in the 2017 vintage, which is the vintage of the Eastridge we're tasting, it was quite warm at night. This is not happening every year, but it was quite warm at night. And we feel that led to lower acidity levels, which is what drove our decision to use less whole cluster that year. So I would say for us, it's the warming nights that seems to be the biggest concern right now.
Cathy, are there other things coming up for you?
For me, it's mostly variability that I've seen, because in the last 10 years, we've had the coldest season ever recorded in the Napa Valley. That was 2011. And then 2017 was the hottest vintage ever recorded. So I think what we're dealing with is variability as much as anything else. I wonder sometimes if warming in the center of California isn't pulling more fog in and cooling. But so far we really can't count on what to expect, because we're just seeing a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, one of the things that's not talked about as much is that actually parts of California, and Napa Valley included, could actually see greater fog influence and cooler temperatures from climate change, rather than, a lot of people assume everything will just get warmer. But actually, as temperatures change, it increases the effect of the Pacific on the inland areas because of how the weather moves through the course of the day. And so there's actually, some areas might see greater fog influence and even cooler temperatures at different points. So, but that variability you're pointing out is really quite a big deal. So one other thing, we're going to have to finish up here pretty soon, but we've gotten a couple of questions I'm going to kind of merge together. So we're talking about sticking to your guns essentially, and not following fashion. Both of you have that in common as well, but that means that there's a real pull your boots up workhorse, financial challenge that's involved. I wonder if you can, each of you can speak to that a little bit. How do you keep going when fashion's not in your favor?
Winemaking is a marathon, not a sprint. And for me, my job is to let the vineyard speak and to express the place in the way I feel it should be. And a corollary to that is I make what I like to drink. I chose the vineyards that would make the style of wine that I like to drink. So I can't really being an estate vineyard, I can't really tweak that very much stylistically. And I just couldn't make myself make a wine that I didn't.
Sorry, there's a bee that's decided it likes me.
So it was really, I believe that a house needs to stand for something, a label needs to stand for something. So we just held on tight through the years.
Yeah. Jasmine, do you want to add to that?
Well, to quote Oscar Wilde, be yourself because everyone else is taken. My father always says, if you have a question, ask the vineyard. And to Cathy's point, when you own vineyards, you've made a choice and you're committed, and all things must flow from the vineyard. And so, to this question of style, our style has changed over the years because as we're relatively new to winemaking, we only started making our own wines in 2002, and we didn't know what we were doing at the beginning. I think we still don't know what we're doing to a great extent in the winery. And we were trying to find a style or an approach to the winemaking that best served my father's greater intention, which was to make wines of place. And so as we've moved through the years and tried different approaches to the winemaking, what we have come to believe is that the style has to serve that greater intention. In other words, the first thing is to show place, and everything else has to flow from that. So our style has changed as we've come a little bit closer maybe to understanding what container, the wine is a container for the terroir, what container will best show that terroir. And we're still learning and evolving, and but and in terms of how to tie that to staying in business, I think you have to be as connected to your customers and to people that drink the wines as you are to the land. And we spend so much time, and we have such wonderful customers, spend so much time, connecting with them. And I think, if you really love a winemaker, love a winery, or love a label, it's important to go on that multi-vintage journey with them. And to support over the years. And for us on our side to have that commitment to our intention so that the drinker can get engaged as well.
Yeah. So we're going to have to start wrapping it up, but one of the things I know is common for both of you as well in terms of, respecting the place really keeps bringing you back to the place itself, to the vines themselves, to the vineyard itself. And that's the reality of the estate model, as both of you have been talking about. one of, the challenge of that is you're anchored to a place that now you must maintain and take care of. But I know in times like this and all the changes that are going on beyond just this situation, it becomes a touchstone too, that you can always return to the place and see how these vines are doing today, and keep going back every day to the vineyard. And I know in terms of winemaking, there's a kind of, Jasmine, you were just talking about listening to the vineyard. If you have a question, go ask the vines. And I know I really hear that from both of you when you talk about winemaking. We didn't focus on that as much today. We really wanted to talk about place and farming, but I hear that consistently from both of you too. When you're in the cellar, like there's a kind of listening, which I don't know that you would use that word necessarily, but from both of you, I really hear a kind of respect for the wine. If I want to respect the place, I have to step back and not impose in the cellar, but really see what does the wine need today too. And maybe it doesn't need much,
Great grapes make great wine, period.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both so very much.
Thank you.
It's pretty incredible to have both of you here today. I know there were more questions. You guys were racing questions. I was keeping up as best I could, but the truth is I had to pick and choose to see what made sense with what we were already talking about. But we're going to send out a follow-up email that's going to address some of them more. And then we'll also be able to, the California wine team has been fantastic and so speedy. So this will also be up and recording later. And again, thank you both so very much for making time. It's really a pleasure to speak with you. And I'm so grateful to see you both too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Yep, thank you to all our panelists and thank you to our attendees. And we hope that you'll join us next week for our third episode, which will be April 21st at 10 a.m. Pacific with Rory Williams, the Director of Viticulture and Winemaking at Frog's Leap Winery and owner and winemaker of Calder Wine Company. So thank you, ladies, again. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.